The events and characters introduced in this film are matters of record that have been the subject of discussion and study in academia for decades. Employing the age-old African tradition of storytelling, we'll piece these events and characters together so as to provide some context and make sense of how we came to be. The story of our existence will be told like it has never been told before. Come with me. This is the story of Uganda. The race to find the source of the Nile, which had been an old-age mystery not even the Egyptians had been able to solve, despite their relative proximity, would lead to an influx of European explorers to the region in the 1850s and 1860s. Of all the early European explorers to the region, none's influence was as consequential as John Rowland, also known as Henry Morton Stanley, a Welsh-American journalist at the New York Herald. Stanley's first visit to the region had come in 1869, when his employer, the New York Herald, sent him to Central Africa as part of one of several search parties commissioned by a variety of entities to find David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary turned explorer. Livingstone, who had set out to Central Africa to find the source of the Nile, had gone missing and had not been heard from for over 3 years. Stanley found Livingstone in Ujiji, a village along the banks of Lake Tanganyika in present-day Tanzania, in November of 1871. Despite his attempts to persuade Livingstone, at seeing his deteriorating health, to take a break from the mission momentarily and return once he was in better health, per Stanley's account, Livingstone refused and was not to be convinced. Just 2 years after this encounter, well after Stanley had left, David Livingstone's health took a turn for the worse, and he died. Despite his struggles, Livingstone had sadly come nowhere close to finding the source of the Nile. To no surprise, European obsession with finding the source of the Nile only intensified after Livingstone's death. Several explorers were hired to head to the Great Lakes region and complete the mission. Among them was Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley's company, the New York Herald, and the Daily Telegraph of London had formed a partnership and pooled their resources together to sponsor Stanley's expedition. While Stanley's familiarity with the region was reason enough to hire him, his enthusiasm and willingness to come back to Africa and complete Livingstone's mission left no doubt in their minds that Stanley was the man for the job. Stanley was tasked to do two things. First was to chart the lakes and rivers in the region. Second, but most importantly, was to find the source of the Nile. Ironically, the mystery in respect to where the source of the Nile was located had already been solved by John Hannington Speke well over a decade ago. Speke, who had first visited the region in 1858 alongside a fellow explorer named Richard Burton, but had been forced to cut his trip short due to illness, had returned to the region in 1862 and navigated Lake Victoria, proving his suspicion that the lake was in fact the source of the Nile. His colleague Richard Burton, however, who led the first expedition, but had fallen seriously ill and resultingly been left behind during the significant parts of the expedition, apparently out of jealousy, had gone out of his way in Europe to cast doubt on Speke's claim. Notwithstanding what it led on in public, per some accounts, privately, Barton had also suspected that Lake Victoria was the source of the Nile. Time would prove that Barton was in fact resentful of Speke, and bitter that someone other than him would get all the glory for finding the source of the Nile. Stanley would clear up any confusion and put the debate between Speke and Barton to rest between 1874 and 1877. After navigating the lake in its entirety, Stanley would prove that Lake Victoria, as had been determined by Speke in 1862, did in fact only have a single outlet, which checked out to be the River Nile. Speke had been correct all along. Lake Victoria was in fact the source of the Nile. Stanley found Buganda in a state of disaster and turmoil. A new form of Islam from Khartoum that was more extreme than the form of Islam that had been practiced locally for decades had been introduced to Buganda. Surprisingly, despite being at odds with most Ganda traditions and threatening the social and political dynamics of the kingdom, many Ganda welcomed it and embraced it. The followers of this new version of Islam, with the support and encouragement of their Khartoum crusaders, found fault with several aspects of how Islam was being practiced in Buganda. When a significant number of Ganda had converted and were now supportive of the doctrines of this new version of Islam, they became more aggressive and nearly uncontrollable, going out of their way to be insubordinate to Mutesa and doing several things to provoke a reaction from him. They demanded that Sharia be officially instituted as the law of the land, and Islamic observance be made mandatory. They also, to Mutesa's annoyance, demanded that he immediately stops assuming the role of Imam at the Lubidi on Fridays, as had become customary. His refusal to get circumcised, they claimed, rendered him a non-Muslim, and in essence, an infidel. The disrespect and insubordination towards Mutesa only grew and became more daring and abrasive as more Ganda adopted the doctrines of this new form of Islam. Enraged, after sending several warnings that seemed to have fallen on deaf ears, Mutesa ordered the arrest of upwards of 1,000 Muslims. The men were marched to Namugongo, where a good fraction of them would be gruesomely executed. They were tied onto large piles of wood before a large crowd of spectators and burned to death, marking the first time on record that people were killed for their religious beliefs in the kingdom, making them the first Buganda martyrs. While some records suggest that as many as 70 men were killed, others claim that this is a severe underestimation, and that the number of people who were burned to death at Namugongo was much, much higher than that. Such was the environment in Buganda when Henry Morton Stanley arrived. Privy to Mutesa's headaches dealing with his Muslim subjects, Stanley took the liberty to speak to Mutesa about Christianity in an effort to convince him that Christianity would be much more conducive for governance. Long story short, it did not take much for Stanley to convince Mutesa to invite and welcome Christian missionaries to Buganda. The reasoning behind Mutesa's decision to welcome missionaries to Buganda, however, is curious. By some accounts, Mutesa's invitation was done not so much because he thought Christianity was better suited for his kingdom, but because he thought it would lead to an influx of European explorers to his region, which would in turn help him get more guns and ammunition, which he desperately needed to fend off Bunyoro and to keep the new era Muslims and their Khartoum influencers in check. Be that as it may, Mutesa's thumbs up to Stanley would open the gates of Uganda to Europeans from all walks of life, Christians and non-Christians alike, and have a major influence on the course of history. In his famous letter, published in the Daily Telegraph on November 15th of 1875, Stanley eulogized the Kingdom of Uganda as the most hopeful field for a missionary endeavor in Central Africa. He then went on to reveal that Mutesa had been receptive to the idea of Christianity, and that he had in fact put out an invitation to Christian missionaries to come to his kingdom. This news was received with immense excitement by the Church Missionary Society. With no delay, the CMS began preparing itself to establish a mission in Buganda. Within a year and a half of Stanley's letter, on June 30th of 1877, the first CMS Anglican missionaries arrived in Uganda. Just 2 years later, a group of French Roman Catholic priests, led by Father Laudel and Brother Dimas, from the White Father Society of Africa, a new Christian institution established in Algiers in 1867, arrived in Uganda. The Church Missionary Society and the White Father Society of Africa were at each other's throats from the onset. The hostility between Catholics and Protestants that had persisted in Europe for centuries had now found its way to Buganda. The tension was only exacerbated by the fact that both groups of missionaries were targeting the same groups of people during their conversion campaigns. Buganda was becoming more and more unruly for the Kabaka as the new religions vied for converts. It appeared that the arrival of Christian missionaries had only fanned the flames of insubordination towards Mutesa in Buganda. And within months of their arrival, Mutesa was already regretting having invited them to his kingdom. When Mutesa died in 1884, he was succeeded by his son Mwanga, who was no more than 16 years of age. Christian missionaries were excited about the new possibilities in Buganda, hanging their hats on Mwanga's youth and hoping that he would be a lot more impressionable than his father was and much more receptive to Christianity. They, however, would be in for a rude awakening. Mwanga's actions would prove that he probably despised these new religions more than his father did. While he was barely a teenager, Mwanga had lived long enough to see with his own two eyes the insubordination and divisiveness these new religions had brought about, and had witnessed firsthand how unruly the Christians had gotten during the last few years of his father's reign. He had vowed to challenge these new religions, and not to let them get in the way of him governing his kingdom. Mwanga's first entanglement with Christians came in 1885, less than a year after he had taken the throne, when he ordered the killing of a missionary named James Hannington, who attempted to cross into Uganda through Busoga. Following the clairvoyance of an oracle who had foretold that the biggest threat to the kingdom of Uganda would come from the east through Busoga, Mwanga calculated that he would get ahead of the problem and spare his kingdom from the misery that had been foreshadowed to follow. Some of Mwanga's subjects, the likes of Joseph Mukasa Balikudembe, the Catholic leader, were riled up and angry when news got around that Hannington had been killed. Balikudembe was particularly beside himself. Having heard that Hannington would be crossing into Uganda through Busoga, and that Mwanga was preparing to send his men to accost him, Balikudembe had personally approached Mwanga and begged him to spare him. News that Hannington had been killed, despite his pleas, had him acting erratically and recklessly. mouthing off about Mwanga and making several unbecoming and disparaging statements about him, all the while continuing to practice Catholicism openly, even after Mwanga had put a ban on practicing Christianity. It should come as no surprise that Mwanga took exception to Balikudembe's behavior. Brimming with anger, without delay, Mwanga turned to the Luchiko and consulted with its members on how to best deal with Balikudembe. Most members of the Luchiko were already aware of Balikudembe's behavior, as some of them had witnessed it firsthand, and they were also just as disturbed with his lack of decorum. It did not take long for the Luchiko to come down with a ruling condemning Balikudembe to death. On November 15th of 1885, Balikudembe was apprehended and executed. Taken as a measure to instill fear in the hearts of Mwanga's disobedient subjects, Balikudembe's beheaded corpse was burnt in clear view of the public on the banks of the Nachabor River. Not long thereafter, Mwanga ordered the arrest of Charles Ranga, who had taken on the leadership of the Catholics after Balikudembe's execution, and the Christian converts under him, who had rebelled against Mwanga's orders and had continued to openly pray and be devout to their newfound religions, even after Balikudembe's gruesome execution. At Mwanga's orders, upwards of 40 Christians were killed in Uganda due to insubordination between 1885 and 1887. Most of the men were killed on June 3rd of 1886 at Namugongo, where they were burnt alive in a public execution. It is worth noting that, while some historians have suggested that Mwanga was a pedophile who ordered the killing of the martyrs after they had refused to engage in homosexual acts with him, these claims are unsubstantiated and appear to have become a topic of discussion decades ensuing the death of Mwanga, in what appears to be a case of revisionist history. For 2 years, in 1886 and 1887, followers of the three alien religions, Muslims, Catholics, and Protestants, armed themselves to the teeth and established formidable paramilitary units, resolved to secure the future of their respective religions in the kingdom. Stockpiles of guns and ammunition were acquired courtesy of the Christian missionaries and Arab traders. Weapons were furnished to the sects by their respective crusaders. The CMS provided arms to the Protestants. The White Fathers provided guns to the Catholics. And the Arabs sourced guns to the Muslims. Such was the situation in Buganda, and Mwanga was not only privy to it, but he in fact encouraged it. Since many of these regiments were manned by youth, Mwanga must have calculated that he would have a lot of influence over them, and that with their support, he could finally get a more solid grip on power in the kingdom, and force older chiefs to finally acknowledge and respect him. Most of the youth recruits, however, had their own ulterior motives for joining these regiments. Many of them were fortune seekers and adventurers who saw membership as the new avenue to progress, and as such were not shy about putting their own personal motives and aspirations ahead of those of the kingdom. They were disrespectful, impudent, and generally lacked a sense of decorum. It was clear that the liberty Mwanga had afforded these paramilitary units had gone to their heads, as they seemed to do whatever they wanted with impunity. Things struck home for Mwanga when one of the paramilitary units attacked his maternal grandparents' house, ransacking it and leaving its tenants traumatized. The impudence was brazen, and a sign of how unhinged and out of control these paramilitary units had gotten. Little did Mwanga know, but the size and strength of these units had gotten to a point where not even his personal military could stand up to them. His plans to retaliate against the paramilitary unit that attacked his grandparents' house were brought to a screeching halt once he realized how enormous and formidable not just this unit was, but all the paramilitary units within his kingdom. Ill-advised, as an attempt to rein his subjects in, a desperate Mwanga stood before the Luchiko and proceeded to declare the immediate banishment of all religious paramilitary units from the kingdom. His declaration, however, came too little too late, and did not sit well with the religious factions. It was in preparation for this very moment that the paramilitary units had been created in the first place. They had known that a time would come where they needed to protect themselves from Mwanga and safeguard their longevity in the kingdom. And that time was now. On September 10th of 1888, the paramilitary units besieged Mwanga and forcibly removed him from the throne, in what some historians have referred to as a bloodless coup. With Mwanga dethroned, the religious factions now busied themselves with appointing a new administration. A task that would prove to be contentious in the initial stages, as not surprisingly, each of the factions wanted one of their own at the helm. Somehow, however, after days of negotiations, a compromise was reached. The Christian factions took a backseat to the Muslims, agreeing to appoint Muslims to most of the top positions in the kingdom, including the Kabakaship. On September 10th of 1888, the very day Mwanga was dethroned, his eldest brother, Prince Mutebi Chiwewa Nonyintono, was crowned the new Kabaka. Chiwewa's reign, however, was short-lived. Within a month of his ascent to the throne, the very Muslims who put him in power had had enough of him. Not only did they dethrone him, but as a sign of how deep their disdain for him was, they chased after him and cut him to pieces. Ironically, Chiwewa's problem in the eyes of many Muslims who despised him was that he had allowed too much religious freedom, specifically as it related to the Catholics and Protestants. These two religious sects had won over a lot more converts than the Muslims had in his short tenure. Shortly after deposing Chiwewa, the Muslims banned Christian missionaries from Buganda and established an administration that was exclusively Muslim. They replaced Chiwewa with his half-brother, Kalema Rashid Muguruma, on October 21st of 1888, who they believed could be counted on and trusted, since unlike his brother, whose faith was questionable, he had followed through with circumcision, proving his commitment to Islam. Kalema's ambition to institute Sharia as the law of the land excited many Muslims who longed for the day Uganda would become an Islamic state. They aspired to institute a version of Sharia modeled after the Sultanate of Zanzibar. Many Baganda, however, were worried about Kalema's regime and feared what lay ahead. Any traditional customs, and make no mistake there were many, that did not align with the doctrines of Islam, were deemed sacrilegious and were to be banned. The decree that all men in the kingdom get circumcised sent shockwaves throughout the kingdom and left many non-Muslims in a state of panic. Kalema's despotic tendencies and ambition to institute what many thought would be draconian laws and regulations instilled immense fear in the hearts of Baganda, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and led to an exodus of people from Buganda like had never been experienced before. Many fled to Ankole, where the Omugabentali warmly received them, while others fled to Bulingugwe Island, joining Kabaka Mwanga. Those in Ankole were under the leadership of Apolokagwa, while in Bulingugwe they were under the leadership of Semei Kapungulu. Together, the exiled Ganda, traditionalists inclusive, schemed to fight the Muslims in unison and bring back normalcy to Uganda. They had reached out to the fallen Kabaka Mwanga beforehand, making peace with him and promising to return him to the throne, should their coup succeed. When word of the imminent attack got around and Kalema got wind of it, he resolved to get ahead of the attack and destroy its masterminds and their followers before they could get to him. Acting on impulse, he went after and assassinated anyone and everyone he thought might have sympathy for Mwanga. His own family members and fellow royals were not beyond the reach of his anger and vindictiveness. Many Ganda princes and princesses were rounded up and executed at Kalema's orders. Meanwhile, the opposition to Kalema's government grew and became more willing to risk it all to dethrone him. The more Ganda fled Buganda, the more the opposition had recruits to pick from and bolster their regiments. Emboldened by the strength they now had in numbers, the Christians and traditionalists advanced upon Buganda, completely besieging the kingdom and taking captive of a few high-ranked Muslims. Narrowly escaping captivity at the hands of the Christians, Kalema scampered off to Bunyoro on October 5th of 1889. Meanwhile, Mwanga was returned to the throne by the Catholics and Protestants, who then went about establishing an administration that was exclusively Christian, excluding Muslims from all levels of government. The alliance between the Protestants and Catholics, however, was extremely precarious and unstable, and it would only be a matter of time before their inability to see eye to eye started threatening their coexistence. They had not only lived in separate camps while exiled, but even when they marched upon Buganda to oust Kalema and his Muslim regime, they remained segregated. Buganda was now more divided than ever, with the members of the three religious factions barely interacting with each other. The Protestants stuck to themselves and only interacted with other Protestants, and so did the Catholics, the Muslims, and the traditionalists. It was at this moment, at a time of unprecedented turmoil, infighting, and division, that Syria's overseas interest in conquering Buganda ramped up. A disturbing number of Buganda had turned on their kingdom and were now more allegiant to their religions. Mwanga's authority and influence had been majorly diminished, and who exactly was in charge, calling the shots on behalf of Uganda, was indeterminable. The divisions along religious lines had become so entrenched that not even the Kabaka could get its subjects to come together for a common cause. It was with this backdrop that the IBEAC came to the region and made its introduction to the people of Buganda. Headed by a decorated British soldier in Frederick Lugard, who had served in Afghanistan, Sudan, and Burma, the IBEAC, which on paper was a private company, even though much of its funding came from the British government, arrived at Buganda's doorstep in the company of no more than 100 Sudanese and Swahili soldiers in December of 1890. In addition to other modern weaponry he wielded, Lugard also had a Maxim gun, a devastating weapon of mass destruction the likes of which the locals had never seen, capable of shooting up to 600 rounds per minute from as far away as 4 kilometers. This weapon alone must have made him feel invincible, as it instilled fear and terrified anyone who knew what it was capable of. Of a sign of how confident he was that Buganda would not be able to stand up to him, Lugard did not even send a messenger to Buganda ahead of his arrival to ask Kabaka Mwanga for his permission to enter the kingdom. He also did not come bearing gifts, as was customary when outsiders visited. The narratives that were being peddled in Europe about Mwanga following the killing of Hannington and the Christian converts a few years back were off-putting to many Europeans and did not win him any favors. While the Protestant faction, now officially under the leadership of Abolokagwa, was excited about Lugard's arrival, Mwanga and the Catholics were not as enthused and had major reservations. On learning that the company was British, Mwanga and his diehard loyalists probably surmised that the company would more than likely favor the Protestants. Inexplicably, despite these concerns, on December 26th of 1890, Uganda entered into a protection treaty with Lugard and the IBEAC. The IBEAC assumed the responsibility of protector of the kingdom, while Lugard assumed the position of military administrator. Considering how disrespectful Lugard had been, it's curious and mind-boggling that Mwanga would agree to sign such a treaty. The terms of the treaty and the events surrounding its signing beg the question: did Mwanga sign the treaty with Lugard clear-eyed and voluntarily, or was he coerced into agreeing to the terms of the treaty? Among other things, the authority to control trade within the kingdom was now in the hands of the IBEAC, and was no longer in the Kabaka, nor the Luchiko's purview. Hut and gun taxes were introduced and were to be paid to the IBEAC and not to the Kabaka. Additionally, the Kabaka could not wage war nor dish out punishment to his adversaries without first consulting with Lugard. In fact, the Kabaka was disallowed from engaging in any form of trade for firearms and was expected to completely be dependent on Lugard for protection. So here lay Buganda, with an estimated population of 2.5 million people at the time, now under the protection of Lugard and his contingent of 100 mercenaries and the IBEAC. By the time Lugard arrived, Kabalega had completely transformed Bunyoro. Bunyoro had repositioned itself as the most prominent kingdom in the region, economically, politically, and militarily. Bunyoro's military strength instilled immense fear and paranoia in the hearts of its neighbors. Still in control of Toro, which he had annexed 2 decades prior in the beginning of Kabalega's reign, Bunyoro was now threatening to seize territories from Buganda and Akole. It should be noted that in addition to the protection treaty he had signed with Buganda, Lugard had also signed a treaty with Prince Kasangama of Toro, whose kingdom had been annexed by Bunyoro in 1875. The young prince had been whisked off to Buganda as an infant when Kabalega attacked and conquered Toro, killing every royal-blooded subject he came across. Shortly after signing the treaty with Kasangama, Lugard, Kasangama, and thousands of gathered troops under the command of Apolokakwa assembled and started westward for Toro. They had Lugard's Maxim gun in tow and were armed to the teeth. Kabalega's Abarushura and Toro were not up for the havoc that ensued. The distraction and devastation of the Maxim gun alone was way too much for the Abarushra to bear. They had never seen, nor experienced anything the likes of the Maxim, capable of causing so much havoc in such a short span. The Abarushra were beaten decisively in Toro by Lugard and his men and chased out of the kingdom altogether. Shortly thereafter, on August 15th of 1891, Lugard officially secured Toro's independence from Bunyoro and installed Prince Kasangama as the Omukama of the kingdom. Meanwhile, in Buganda, the weak Protestant and Catholic coalition had continued to crumble and deteriorate. It is worth noting that the inability to see eye to eye between these Christian groups predated the arrival of Christian missionaries to Uganda. The two had been at each other's throats since Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, outlining his 95 objections against the Catholic Scripture. Several European nations that were once strong Catholic strongholds started seeing massive shifts from Catholicism to Anglicanism in the mid to late 17th century. Many wars were fought all throughout Europe between the Protestants and Catholics, most notably the 30-Year War in Germany that lasted from 1618 to 1648, in which some estimates suggest that the populations of the affected regions declined by more than 50%. While the inability to see eye to eye between the two Christian sects had pre-existed the Muslim reign in Buganda, they had been set aside momentarily when the two sects joined forces and deposed Kalema. The Catholics and Protestants had not only fought gallantly in unison to remove Kalema and the Muslims from power, but they also had even managed to come to terms on how to structure a government that was all-inclusive, promoting and advocating each party's interests. A power-sharing scheme in which the positions of Uganda's hierarchy were to be assigned in an alternating sequence between the Catholics and Protestants was agreed upon. Since the Kabaka was a self-proclaimed Catholic, the second in command, the Katikiro, was to be a Protestant. The third in command would be a Catholic, the fourth a Protestant, and so forth in this order. While both parties were initially content and satisfied with this scheme of governance, this did not last. When a significant number of chiefs who had once proclaimed themselves to be Protestants started converting to Catholicism to align themselves with Kabaka Mwanga, who had also proclaimed his Catholicism, the Protestants started questioning the fairness of this scheme. They had lost a great deal of representation in the Luchiko and Sazas as a result of officials converting from Anglicanism to Catholicism. Feeling shortchanged, the Protestants appealed to the IBEAC to institute changes. They suggested that a rule be implemented, making it such that if a chief who once identified as a Protestant decides to convert and become a Catholic, he will not only be stripped of his chieftaincy and replaced with a Protestant, but it would also be required to vacate his village and migrate to a Catholic village. The IBEAC initially appeared to be neutral, refusing to meddle in these affairs and offering no direction. Meanwhile, the tension between the two Christian groups continued to grow and get out of hand. It soon became hard for Protestants and Catholics to live in harmony within proximity to each other. Altercations and full-on brawls between the Protestants and Catholics had become a common occurrence by 1891. They had developed a deep distrust and distaste for each other in just a matter of a few years. The tension escalated and reached its breaking point in January of 1892 after the death of a Protestant, allegedly at the hands of a Catholic. While the details of that death are up for debate, The Protestants were outraged and wanted to avenge the death of one of their own. It was amidst this turmoil that Lugard finally showed his hand, openly throwing his support behind the Protestants, who not long thereafter, emboldened by Lugard's support, went on to declare war against the Catholics. Mwanga and the Catholics were no match for the Protestants. Lugard would later gleefully write about his experience in this war, and how he would fire off his Maxim gun towards the advancing Catholics, who for a moment appeared to have the advantage, in killing 5 to 6 Catholics at a time, and how by virtue of the devastation and havoc wreaked by the Maxim, the Protestants were able to seize control of the kingdom, notwithstanding being majorly outnumbered by the Catholics. Mwanga and the Catholics were dislodged from their positions in Mengo and Rubaga, with Lugard and the Protestants nipping at their heels in hot pursuit. They were forced to hop into their canoes and escaped to Bulingugwe Island. Back on the mainland, Lugard set Mwanga Zubidi and neighboring huts and structures ablaze. When the dust had settled, by some accounts, upwards of 700 Uganda Catholics had been killed. The Protestants, on the other hand, had not incurred anywhere as many deaths. The Protestants were initially resolved to be the sole possessors of political power in the kingdom. They had no intention of sharing political office with the Catholics, much less the Muslims and traditionalists. The White Fathers, however, threw a wrench in his plans. Indignant after losing the Battle of Mengo to Lugard and the Protestants, they launched a crusade to bring attention to Lugard and his atrocities in the scuffle. By siding with the Protestants, who were overwhelmingly outnumbered by the Catholics, and providing them with guns, particularly the Maxim gun, which he personally was in charge of, they alleged that Lugard was not only directly involved in instigating the war, but his involvement also led to more deaths and casualties. As an attempt to salvage his reputation, Lugard negotiated with Mwanga and exiled Catholics and Muslims, and somehow managed to convince them to return to Uganda before he could depart from the Great Lakes region and embark upon his long trip back to Europe in mid-1892. Lugard had gotten a lot of flack and criticism in Britain for having facilitated sectarianism in Uganda by siding with the Protestants in the war. His reinstallment of Mwanga to the throne was done to give the impression to folks in Europe that things were still as they were when he first arrived. Following the war, Buganda's land was carved up and allocated along religious lines. The Protestants were awarded nearly 60% of Buganda's land. They took Kampala and all the surrounding counties. The Catholics were relegated to Budu, while the Muslims retired in Busuju, Butambala, and Gomba. A treaty placing Buganda under the protection of the IBEAC through 1894 was signed on March 30th of 1892. The treaty was signed in the presence of several witnesses. Lugard, the resident, signed on behalf of the IBEAC, while Kabaka Mwanga signed on behalf of Uganda. The treaty was reportedly translated to Uganda and read out aloud to the Kabaka and the witnesses, since many of them could not read nor write. A simple X on the signature line was deemed sufficient. It is important to note that the terms of the treaty did not favor Mwanga. Why Mwanga would agree to sign such a treaty, essentially stripping him of all his powers, was mind-boggling. Even some of Lugard's fellow countrymen, back in Britain, had raised eyebrows, curious as to what Lugard had done to convince Mwanga to agree to the terms of the treaty. The matter was even once a topic of discussion in the British Parliament. Mr. W. E. Gladstone was noted for his outspokenness on the matter. Gladstone suspected that Lugard had extorted the signatures from Mwanga. The civil war in Buganda was expensive, so much so that it drove the IBEAC to near bankruptcy. The IBEAC at one point even seriously considered abandoning its mission in the kingdom. It was so broke. In desperation, the IBEAC turned to the British Parliament and requested for a subsidy. It threatened to abandon its mission if funding was not forthcoming, going as far as withdrawing its president, Frederick Lugard, from the kingdom in May of 1892. The British, however, were still not convinced that what they stood to gain from Buganda was worth the expenditure. They just were not sold on the idea that the juice was worth the squeeze. Besides, they were involved in several other imperial endeavors across the globe, which they thought would be much more lucrative. When Lugard returned to Britain in mid-1892, he launched his own campaign advocating for Britain's official colonization of Buganda. He claimed that the people of Buganda themselves had appealed to him to beg the British to colonize them. To help drive his point, Lugard arrived in Britain with 2 letters he alleged were written by Kabaka Mwanga. The first letter was addressed to Queen Victoria, while the second was addressed to British citizens. The letters thanked the Queen for having entrusted Lugard and the IBEAC with protecting Buganda. Mwanga apparently confessed that while he had not trusted the IBEAC at the onset, he had since come around and now sees the good the company has done for his kingdom. He supposedly praised the IBEAC for having brought about peace in the kingdom, thanks to Lugard's efforts to subdue the Muslims and to keep Kabalega in check. Mwanga allegedly went on to beg the Queen not to remove the IBEAC from Buganda, fearing that there would be anarchy in the kingdom if the company left. He allegedly also requested that Captain Lugard be returned to Buganda to complete the good work he had already laid a foundation for. It's curious, however, how Mwanga could have written the letters Lugard claimed he had written, considering he couldn't even write his own name when he entered treaties with Lugard, resorting to simply marking the signature line with an X. Public opinion in Britain was divided. Some kind-hearted Brits believed that a robust British presence in the region was necessary to help curb slave trade, which they had heard was pervasive in the region. Others contended that the high cost of administering Buganda did not justify its pursuit by the British. The IBEAC's cost to administer the kingdom was estimated at £40,000 annually, which was a steep price to pay in those days, especially for a place many did not expect could ever turn a profit. Bishop Alfred Tucker of the CMS, who had served as the Anglican bishop to East Equatorial Africa since 1890 and was a big proponent of Britain's official colonization of Buganda, launched his own fundraising campaign in Britain on behalf of the IBEAC. Tucker feared that Buganda would descend into war and that the Protestant slaves would be in peril if the IBEAC left the kingdom. With the support of the CMS, within a matter of weeks, Tucker had raised enough money to keep the IBEAC in Buganda through December of 1892. In late 1892, Lord Gladstone, the new Prime Minister of Britain, who like Lord Salisbury before him, also initially had no interest in Buganda, eventually capitulated to pressure from such enthusiasts as Rosebery, the British Foreign Secretary at the time and future Prime Minister, and provided the IBEAC with a subsidy that would sustain its operations and keep its agents in Buganda through March of 1893. Despite Lugard's desires to return to Buganda and continue serving as the resident, he was assigned to other missions and never returned. It should be noted that public opinion of Lugard back home in Britain was not the best. Many were suspicious of Lugard's claim that Mwanga had signed the Treaty of Protection voluntarily, and thought that the only way Mwanga may have signed the treaty is if he had been put under duress by Lugard. In December of 1892, the British appointed Gerard Porter the British Special Commissioner to East Africa. Among other directives, Porter was ordered to conduct an assessment of Uganda and report back to the Crown as to whether Uganda would be worth pursuing as a colony. Porter arrived in Uganda on March 17th of 1893. Just weeks after his arrival, on April 1st of 1893, Porter lowered the IBEAC flag at Mengo and raised the Union Jack, in a gesture that laid the foundation and paved the way for Buganda's official transfer from the IBEAC to British rule. Not surprisingly, many Uganda failed to recognize the significance of this moment, having been under the impression that they had been under British rule all along, having thought that the IBEAC flag that had been hoisted at Mengo when Lugard arrived in the kingdom was in fact the British flag. A little over 2 months after his arrival, on May 29th of 1893, Porter signed a provisional treaty with Kabaka Mwanga, which unofficially secured Buganda as a British protectorate. This treaty was similar to the ones the Kabaka had allegedly signed with Lugard. The treaty, however, was merely a stopgap. The British government had not given Porter permission to enter into a treaty on its behalf with Buganda. His decision to sign a treaty fell outside the scope of his mandate, as he had only been commissioned to determine if it made sense for the British to move forward with officially colonizing Buganda. After months of careful diplomacy, observation, and quiet assessment in the royal courts of Buganda, Sir Gerard Porter, Britain's handpicked envoy, returned to London with a mission that could alter the course of the Great Lakes region. In his possession, detailed notes, private letters, and a final memorandum. His answer to the question haunting the empire's inner circle: should Britain seize Buganda or let it slip beyond its grasp? But fate would intervene. Mere weeks after arriving home, Porter fell gravely ill. Typhoid. The fever took him before he could ever stand before a parliament. His report, unread. His recommendation, never presented. With Porter gone, the British Empire was left adrift, at a crossroads. Should it press forward into the heart of Uganda, or retreat and walk away from a kingdom it barely understood?